Hello, Libra. I hope you're ready, because the energy coming through today feels impossible to ignore. This doesn't feel like a passing thought or a temporary emotion. It feels like someone is finally beginning to understand what this connection truly means to them. The more they try to move on, the more your presence seems to follow them. The more they try to make sense of their feelings, the deeper those feelings become. So today, we're going to explore what may be happening in their heart, what they're realizing now, and why this connection continues to stay with them. Welcome in, my beautiful Libra friends. I'm Henry, and I'm so thankful you're here. Let's see what the cards have to say. Libra, the first thing I notice here is that this person keeps trying to explain you away. They keep trying to find a logical reason for why you're on their mind. And honestly, that strategy isn't working anymore. Because every time they think they've figured it out, every time they tell themselves they're being dramatic or reading too much into things, something happens that pulls them right back toward you. The Lovers is sitting here, and what strikes me isn't even the intensity of the attraction. It's the fact that they keep comparing every experience back to you. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment that should have distracted them somehow ends up reminding them of you instead. And I don't think they expected that. I don't think this was supposed to become such a significant connection in their life. For a while, they may have believed they could keep everything in neat little boxes. Feelings over here, responsibilities over there, life moving forward exactly as planned. But then you came along, and suddenly things became more complicated. Not in a chaotic way. More in a way that forced them to look deeper than they usually do. Because when they're around you, they feel understood, not judged, not pressured, not forced to be someone else, just understood. And that feeling stays with them long after you're gone. Okay, and that's where things start getting interesting. Because Page of Cups keeps bringing me back to these quiet moments when they're alone. The moments nobody else sees. The moments when they're driving somewhere, staring out a window, sitting in bed, unable to sleep, and your name just drifts into their thoughts without warning. It's almost frustrating for them. Because part of them wants a simple explanation. Part of them wants to say, oh, I'm just nostalgic, or maybe I'm just lonely, or maybe I'm overthinking this. But deep down they know that's not really what's happening, because if it were that simple, the feeling would have disappeared by now. Instead, it keeps growing. It keeps finding new ways to show up. And what I'm hearing very strongly is this question. Why do I keep thinking about this person? Why does their opinion matter so much to me? Why do I feel calmer when I talk to them? Why do I feel like they somehow see parts of me that other people overlook? Wow, that realization feels bigger than they're willing to admit. Justice is here, and it feels like this person is beginning to have a very honest conversation with themselves. Not with you, not with their friends, with themselves. Because they've spent so much time analyzing the connection from every possible angle, trying to weigh the pros and cons, trying to understand what makes you different, trying to figure out why your energy lingers in a way that others don't. And the answer they're slowly arriving at is surprisingly simple. You matter to them, more than they expected, more than they planned for, more than they initially wanted to admit. And honestly, Libra, that realization feels a little scary. Because once you admit something matters, you also have to admit it has the power to affect you. And this person isn't completely comfortable with that vulnerability. The moon is bringing in another layer here. Because there are still emotions they haven't fully explored. There are still feelings sitting beneath the surface. Things they haven't put into words. Things they haven't even confessed to themselves yet. I keep seeing someone lying awake at night, replaying conversations, remembering little details, the way you laughed, the way you responded to something, the way you made them feel safe enough to be themselves. And what fascinates me is that they aren't only thinking about what happened. They're thinking about what it meant. They're revisiting moments that once seemed ordinary and realizing they carried much more emotional weight than they originally believed. It's almost like they're seeing the connection through a completely different lens now. And the more they look at it, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The harder it becomes to pretend this is just another passing chapter. Because something about you continues to leave an impression. Something about your honesty, your warmth, your ability to create balance around you. Something about that keeps echoing in their heart, and I don't feel like they've reached the end of that realization yet. If anything, it feels like they're only beginning to understand how deeply this connection has affected them. Because there are still thoughts they haven't spoken, still emotions they haven't confronted. And as these cards continue to unfold, it feels like those hidden feelings are becoming harder and harder for them to ignore. What keeps standing out to me here is how much energy this person spends pretending they're okay. Not because they're trying to fool you, Honestly, Libra, I think they're trying to fool themselves. Because if they can convince themselves that everything is fine, then maybe they don't have to look too closely at what's really happening inside. Maybe they don't have to admit how often your name crosses their mind. Maybe they don't have to admit how much they miss the comfort they felt around you. But the silence between you has done something unexpected. Instead of helping them move on, it has created space. Space to think. Space to remember. Space to feel things they were too distracted to notice before. And that's where Nine of Swords starts showing up in a very human way. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just restless. The kind of restlessness that shows up when the world gets quiet, when there are no notifications, no conversations, no distractions, just their own thoughts staring back at them. And that's not always a comfortable place for them to be, because memories have a funny way of returning when we least expect them. A certain song, a familiar place, a random phrase someone says, and suddenly they're back in a moment they thought they had forgotten. What's interesting is that they don't seem to be remembering the big things. They're remembering the small things, the details, the moments that seemed insignificant at the time. The way you listened. The way you noticed things other people ignored. The way conversations with you felt effortless. It's almost like Six of Cups is pulling these memories to the surface one by one, and each memory carries a question. Why did that matter so much to me? Why do I still remember that? Why does that moment still make me feel something? Because honestly, Libra, people don't usually carry memories like that unless there was meaning attached to them. And the more distance grows between the two of you, the more those memories seem to gain value. What once felt ordinary now feels important. What once felt available now feels rare. There is something about absence that changes perspective. Something about not having access to someone anymore that makes you realize how much space they occupied in your life. And I feel like that's exactly where this person is right now. They're looking at their life, looking at their routines, looking at the people around them, and quietly noticing what's missing. Not because their life has stopped, not because everything suddenly became terrible, but because your energy brought something unique into their world, something they haven't been able to replace. Three of Swords feels less like heartbreak here and more like regret. The regret of understanding something too late. The regret of seeing value after distance has already entered the picture. Because I don't think they fully appreciated how safe they felt around you. I don't think they fully appreciated how much emotional peace your presence brought them. People often realize comfort after it's gone. They notice consistency after silence arrives. And this person seems to be having that realization in slow motion. Day by day, memory by memory, thought by thought. Wow, there's something very lonely about that. Not lonely because nobody is around them. Lonely because the one person they genuinely want to talk to isn't standing beside them right now. And even if they're surrounded by friends, coworkers, responsibilities, or daily obligations, there are moments when none of it feels quite the same. Because their mind keeps wandering back to you. Their heart keeps revisiting unfinished emotions. Seven of Swords is interesting because it feels like they're still hiding some of this from themselves. Not completely, but enough. Enough to maintain the image that they're unaffected. Enough to continue telling people they're doing fine. Enough to avoid difficult conversations. Yet the truth keeps leaking through the cracks. The truth appears in quiet moments. The truth appears when they're alone with their thoughts. The truth appears when they catch themselves wondering what you're doing, whether you're happy, whether you've moved on, whether you're thinking about them too. And honestly, those questions seem to be happening more frequently lately. What fascinates me is that they aren't only missing you. They're missing the version of themselves that existed around you, the version that felt understood, the version that didn't have to explain every emotion, the version that felt seen. That's a powerful realization, because sometimes we think we're missing a person when we're actually missing the experience of being known by that person. And Libra, there's a sense that this individual is beginning to understand that difference. They're beginning to understand why your absence feels heavier than they expected, why certain memories refuse to fade, why every attempt to push the connection aside somehow leads them right back to it. And the more they sit with those thoughts, the harder it becomes to keep pretending this connection didn't leave a mark on them, because it did, in ways they're only starting to recognize. And I keep feeling this hesitation, this pause, almost like they're standing at the edge of a realization they haven't fully stepped into yet. They're close enough to see it, close enough to feel it, but not quite ready to say it out loud, at least not yet. There's a moment that keeps coming through here, Libra, where this person stops looking outward and starts looking inward. And honestly, I don't think they expected what they would find. Because for a long time, it was easier to focus on circumstances, easier to focus on timing, easier to focus on everything happening around the connection instead of what was happening inside their own heart. But the hermit keeps bringing them back to themselves, back to the quiet, back to the questions they've been avoiding. And those questions are becoming harder to ignore, because the more distance they have from certain situations, the clearer those situations begin to look. It's almost as if they're revisiting old chapters with a completely different perspective. The choices they once defended, the decisions they once felt confident about, the paths they once believed would make them happy. They're looking at all of it differently now. And wow, that realization doesn't feel comfortable. Because sometimes growth isn't about discovering something new. Sometimes it's about admitting something old was never working in the first place. That's what this energy feels like. A person sitting alone with their thoughts and realizing that some of the things they fought for weren't actually bringing them fulfillment. Some of the people they prioritized weren't showing up for them the way they expected. Some of the situations they invested their energy into ended up leaving them feeling empty. And that's where Five of Cups starts whispering through the reading. Not as punishment, not as suffering, but as awareness. Because regret has a way of appearing when clarity arrives. This person seems to be noticing all the moments they overlooked. The moments when you were trying. The moments when you showed patience. The moments when you offered understanding instead of judgment. They're seeing those memories differently now, not as ordinary moments, not as things that simply happened, but as evidence of how much you genuinely cared. Okay, this feels important. Because I don't think they fully understood your value while they had access to your energy. Not because they didn't care, but because they assumed it would always be there. And human beings do that sometimes. We get used to certain people. We get comfortable. We start believing that the things bringing us peace today will still be there tomorrow, until one day, they aren't. And suddenly, we begin noticing all the things we stopped appreciating. This person keeps coming back to the same thought, the same uncomfortable realization. Nobody made them feel quite the way you did. Nobody brought the same balance into their life. Nobody challenged them to become a better version of themselves while still making them feel accepted exactly as they were. That's rare. And I think they're finally beginning to understand how rare it was. Justice is creating a very honest atmosphere around this reading, because excuses don't seem to be working anymore. Blame doesn't seem to be working anymore. Avoidance doesn't seem to be working anymore. There's a level of accountability developing here. A willingness to look at the situation and say, maybe I didn't handle that as well as I thought. Maybe I wasn't fully present. Maybe I took something meaningful for granted. Those realizations are not easy, especially for someone who spent a long time convincing themselves they had made the right choices. Because once those walls begin to crack, everything starts coming into question. The direction they took, the relationships they invested in, the priorities they held, people they listened to, even the stories they told themselves. And the deeper they look, the more they seem to arrive at the same conclusion. The connection with Libra was different. Not perfect, not without challenges, but different, meaningful, real, authentic. And what strikes me here is that they're no longer comparing you to other people. They're comparing other people to you. There's a huge difference. Because when someone becomes the standard, it changes everything. Suddenly, the conversations don't feel as engaging. The emotional connection doesn't feel as deep. The trust doesn't feel as natural. The sense of peace doesn't feel as consistent. And that's when people begin asking themselves difficult questions. Questions they may have spent months avoiding. Why am I still thinking about this person? Why do I still care? Why does their absence still affect me? Why does it feel like something important is missing? Those questions seem to be following them everywhere. And I don't think they're finding easy answers. What I feel instead is a growing awareness that this connection left a much bigger impact than they originally realized. Judgment is sitting here like a wake-up call. Not loud, not dramatic, just impossible to ignore. The kind of realization that arrives slowly, one piece at a time, one memory at a time, one honest conversation with yourself at a time. And every piece seems to be leading them toward the same understanding. They weren't seeing the full picture before. They were seeing fragments, pieces, moments, but not the whole story. The whole story includes your patience, your kindness, your consistency, the emotional safety you created, the way you showed up when things weren't easy, the way you stayed genuine even when circumstances became complicated. Those details matter more now than they ever did before, because they're no longer viewing the connection through the lens of convenience. They're viewing it through the lens of absence, and absence has a way of revealing value. The more they sit with that truth, the more difficult it becomes to dismiss what they're feeling. because this isn't simply nostalgia anymore. This isn't just remembering the past. This feels like someone slowly accepting that they may have misunderstood the significance of a person who brought far more into their life than they realized at the time. And honestly, Libra, that understanding seems to be changing the way they see everything. What feels different here, Libra, is that this person is no longer asking themselves whether something needs to change. They're beginning to understand that something already is. Not because anyone forced them, not because somebody gave them an ultimatum, but because the life they've been carrying no longer fits the person they're becoming. And honestly, that's not an easy thing to accept. Because change sounds exciting when we talk about it. It sounds inspiring. It sounds hopeful. Until it starts asking us to let go of things we've known for years. Until it starts asking us to walk away from habits, relationships, and patterns that once felt familiar. That's where death keeps showing up in this story, not as an ending filled with fear. More like a person standing in front of a mirror and realizing they can't keep pretending anymore. Pretending they're happy where they are. Pretending certain relationships are healthy. Pretending certain environments don't drain them. Pretending certain behaviors haven't been hurting them. Wow, there is something incredibly honest happening inside this person right now. Because the same awareness that helped them recognize your value is also helping them recognize everything that has been standing in the way of their own growth. And that's uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, because it's one thing to admit you miss someone. It's another thing entirely to admit that parts of your life need to change. I keep feeling this energy of someone looking around and realizing they've been carrying things that don't belong to them anymore. Old expectations, old fears, old responsibilities, old versions of themselves. And the strange thing is, they may have spent years believing those things were protecting them, when in reality, those things were keeping them stuck. Strength feels very different in this reading than people might expect. This doesn't feel like someone becoming louder. It doesn't feel like someone becoming more aggressive. It feels like someone becoming more honest. Someone learning how to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of running from them. Someone learning how to say, yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I avoided certain truths. Yes, I let fear influence my decisions, and honestly, Libra, that takes courage. Because it's easier to blame circumstances. It's easier to blame timing. It's easier to blame other people. But this person seems to be moving away from that mindset. They're beginning to take ownership of their own emotional world, and that's a huge shift. Because ownership creates change. Blame creates stagnation. The more responsibility they take for their choices, the more power they have to create something different. And I think they're starting to see that. They're starting to understand that healing isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming honest. It's about looking directly at your wounds and saying, okay, this happened. Okay, this affected me. Okay, I need to deal with this. Instead of spending years pretending nothing hurts, there are old disappointments surfacing here. Old fears of rejection, old insecurities, old emotional scars that may have influenced how they approached relationships for a very long time. And for some reason, your connection seems to have brought those wounds into the light. Not because you caused them, because you made it harder to ignore them. That's what happens sometimes when we meet someone who sees us clearly. The masks stop working. The excuses stop working. The distractions stop working. And that's exactly what this feels like. A person who can no longer hide from themselves. Wheel of Fortune creates this feeling that their perspective is shifting. Not overnight, not all at once, but gradually. One realization leading to another. One lesson leading to another. One difficult truth creating space for a healthier one. And what's interesting is that their priorities seem to be changing as well. Things that once felt important suddenly feel less important. Things they once chased no longer bring the same satisfaction. Things they once tolerated are becoming harder to tolerate. Because once awareness expands, it's difficult to go back to sleep. It's difficult to pretend you don't know what you know. And that's creating movement inside this person. A desire for something more stable, something more authentic, something that actually aligns with who they are becoming. Four of Pentacles keeps drawing my attention toward what they're releasing. Because this isn't just about holding on anymore. It's about understanding what needs to be put down. Some people carry emotional baggage so long that they forget what life feels like without it. And I think this person has carried certain fears for a very long time. Fear of vulnerability, fear of disappointment, fear of trusting the wrong people, fear of making the wrong choices. But carrying those fears hasn't protected them. It has only made their world smaller, and they're beginning to see that. They're beginning to realize that living according to other people's expectations has cost them pieces of themselves. Living according to fear has cost them opportunities. Living according to old wounds has cost them emotional freedom. That's a powerful realization. Because once someone understands the price they've been paying, they naturally start questioning whether they want to keep paying it. And I feel that happening here. Not dramatically, not recklessly, very thoughtfully, very intentionally, like someone carefully reorganizing their life from the inside out. Looking at every belief, every relationship, every habit, every emotional pattern, and asking, does this still belong in my future? Because the future they're imagining now seems different from the future they imagined before. More grounded, more peaceful, more honest. Less focused on appearances, less focused on pleasing everyone around them, less focused on becoming who others expect them to be, and more focused on becoming who they genuinely are. The deeper they move into that transformation, the harder it becomes to stay connected to things that no longer reflect their truth. And honestly, Libra, that transformation seems to be reaching a point where it can no longer remain entirely internal. There's a feeling coming through here that reminds me of someone standing in front of a closed door for a very long time. Not because they don't know what's behind it, not because they're unsure how they feel, but because opening that door means they can no longer hide from the truth. And that's exactly where this person seems to be. Because all of this reflection, all of this growth, all of these realizations have slowly led them toward one uncomfortable conclusion. Silence isn't helping anymore. Keeping everything inside isn't helping anymore. Pretending they don't care isn't helping anymore. Judgment feels very present here, not as a dramatic awakening. More like a deep internal knowing that keeps returning no matter how hard they try to push it away. The same thoughts, the same emotions, the same unfinished conversation. It's almost as though their heart keeps returning to the same place over and over again. And that place somehow always leads back to you. What strikes me is how much time they've spent rehearsing things they haven't actually said. You know those moments when someone is alone and starts having imaginary conversations in their head, thinking about what they would say, thinking about how the other person might respond, thinking about all the words they wish they had spoken months ago. I keep seeing that energy. A person revisiting old moments and mentally rewriting them, not because they can change the past, but because they finally understand what they should have said, what they should have acknowledged, what they should have appreciated. There are apologies sitting inside this person, words they've carried for much longer than anyone realizes. Some of those apologies aren't even about a specific event. They're about the overall feeling. The feeling that they didn't show up the way they should have. The feeling that they left certain things unsaid. The feeling that they allowed fear, confusion, pride, or uncertainty to create distance where closeness could have existed. And that's difficult for them to sit with, because growth brings awareness. Awareness brings responsibility, and responsibility asks us to look directly at the parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. The lovers keeps appearing here like a quiet reminder of what this connection means to them, not in a fantasy-driven way, not in an idealized way, but in a very human way, because relationships become meaningful through shared moments, through trust, through vulnerability, through emotional safety. And I think they're realizing how rare that really was, especially when they compare it to other experiences they've had. The comparison isn't even intentional anymore. It just happens. Someone says something, and it reminds them of you. Someone treats them a certain way, and they remember how different it felt with you. Someone enters their life, and they realize they're still measuring emotional depth against a connection they thought they had moved beyond. Wow. That's a heavy realization. Because once you acknowledge that someone still occupies that kind of space in your heart, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. What do I do about it? That's where the fear starts showing up. Because Eight of Wands brings movement into a situation that has been sitting still for a very long time. And movement sounds exciting until you remember that movement creates uncertainty. The moment they reach out, things become real. The moment they speak, there's no taking the words back. The moment they become vulnerable, they lose control over the outcome. That's what they're wrestling with, not their feelings. Their feelings seem increasingly clear. What they're wrestling with is risk, because opening their heart creates the possibility of rejection. And rejection feels especially intimidating when someone truly matters. It's easier to be brave when you don't care. It's harder when you care deeply. I feel that very strongly here. This isn't someone casually thinking about sending a message. This feels more personal than that. Because they're not simply trying to reconnect. They're trying to bridge a gap that has existed for a long time. They're trying to approach a conversation carrying months, maybe even years, of emotions they never fully expressed. And that's intimidating. Sometimes people think courage means being fearless. But what I'm seeing here looks different. It looks like fear sitting in the passenger seat while someone decides to move forward anyway. It looks like uncertainty existing alongside sincerity. It looks like vulnerability becoming stronger than avoidance. Four of Wands creates a feeling of emotional stability becoming more important to them than emotional comfort. For a long time, comfort may have meant staying quiet, avoiding difficult conversations, avoiding accountability, avoiding uncomfortable truths. But emotional stability requires something different. It requires honesty. It requires authenticity. It requires showing up as your real self instead of the version that's easiest to protect. And I think they're beginning to understand that, because the version of themselves that stayed silent wasn't finding peace. The version of themselves that avoided difficult emotions wasn't finding peace. The version of themselves that kept everything locked away wasn't finding peace either. So they're standing at an emotional crossroads, looking back at everything they've learned, looking at the person they've been becoming, looking at the connection that continues to occupy such an important place in their heart. And for perhaps the first time in a very long time, they seem less focused on protecting themselves and more focused on being truthful. Not perfect, not fearless, just truthful. Because some feelings eventually become too important to keep carrying alone. And the deeper this realization settles into their heart, the more it feels like they're preparing themselves to stop speaking only inside their own mind and start expressing what they've been holding back for far too long. Sometimes the biggest realization isn't discovering something new. It's finally admitting what your heart has known for a very long time. And that's the feeling I'm leaving this reading with. A person who tried to make sense of their emotions. A person who tried to move forward. A person who tried to convince themselves that this connection wasn't as important as it felt. Yet somehow, they keep arriving at the same place. The same memories, the same feelings, the same person. And perhaps that understanding is changing far more than they ever expected. That's all I've got for you for this reading. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it. You all mean a lot, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Okay.